Hello, I'm Ishbel Matheson here at the Overseas Development Institute, and with me is our senior researcher, Romilly Greenhill, and we're going to be talking today about the 0.7% international aid pledge and British politics. Romilly, last week, 0.7% was the number that was blazoned across the headlines. A lot of speculation that Mrs May would ditch the foreign aid pledge of 0.7%. She subsequently came out on Friday and said no, she wasn't going to do that, but then raised some questions about perhaps they were going to look at how it's spent. So that's what we're going to discuss today. If you on Facebook Live would like to ask us any questions, please do. And we will start with asking Romilly just a little bit about your own background in this issue. You've worked on this issue now for, well,
more years than
a few years.
Yes, more years than I care to remember. No, absolutely. I've been working on aid for quite some time. I've worked in both Cambodia and Uganda, and I've actually seen the impacts of British aid firsthand in both those countries and elsewhere. I was also quite centrally involved in the 2005 Make Poverty History campaign, which was actually the moment where all the major political parties committed to the 0.7% target and also, crucially, set a timetable for its achievement.
And I should say, please do share the video as you type in your questions as well. But Romilly, just explain to us a little bit. It became a very totemic pledge, but what is the history of the 0.7% pledge?
So the 0.7% target, which just to clarify is the target for 0.7% of gross national income to be spent on aid. That target was initially agreed in 1970, so 47 years ago. Originally it was supposed to be met by 1980 at the latest. So it came out of an initial proposal for a 1% transfer from rich countries to poor countries of both public and private flows. And that was proposed in the 1960s.
By who?
In fact, initially by the World Council of Churches, interestingly enough, and then it fed into the UN negotiations. Now, the challenge they fairly quickly found is that for private flows, you can't really influence that directly by public policy. You can't really be held accountable for the volume of private flows to developing countries. So the 0.7% was then agreed as the public contribution to that 1%.
So then subsequently, several years after, well, decades after it was supposed to be implemented, it came to be enshrined in law here in the UK. Why was that, and how did that come about?
Absolutely, it did. It was actually in the manifestos of all the major political parties coming into the 2010 election. So after the sort of mid-2000s, the Make Poverty History campaign, Live Aid, the mass mobilisation around aid and development issues, the 2005 Greenhill's commitments. So all the political parties at that point made the commitment and decided in their 2010 manifestos for it to be enshrined in law. What subsequently happened, there was a lack of parliamentary time in the coalition government, the 2010 government. So actually it was a private member's bill from a Liberal Democrat that was actually tabled. It was very high up on the list, and they managed to get that bill through just at the last minute in the 2015 Parliament. But it did have very wide degree of cross-party support at that time. There was only a small number of MPs actually voted against the bill at that time.
Mm-hmm. And we are talking about the International Aid Pledge and its importance in the UK election. This is Romilly Greenhill, one of ODI's experts on this. Romilly, that was really a kind of high point, wasn't it? You know, of the support for international development, massive public support, those huge marches at Gleneagles and so on. Mm-hmm. Quite a lot's changed since then, hasn't it? In terms of where we are now, what do you think is different between then and now?
Well, I think we're living in an age of austerity, and there's a lot of concern of sort of value for money, and also this issue of sort of using aid in the national interest. And I think this is one of the things that we've really got to look out for going forward now. Theresa May has recommitted to 0.7, which I think is extremely welcome, but talked about maybe changing the way it's going to be spent and the focus of aid. And I think there's maybe three things that we need to look out for there. The first is around, is aid going to be used more for sort of security, peace-building expenditures? Now, that's something actually under the OECD rules, the agreed rules for ODA, is very difficult. So there may be a little bit of wiggle room, and the rules have been changed quite recently, but I'm not sure that we'll see a massive shift there. The second issue is around potentially using aid more to kind of promote British businesses, British exports, British economic interests more broadly. And I think there actually is quite a lot of wiggle room in the rules. And actually quite a lot of countries have and do continue to try and use aid in that way. So that's something we've really got to look out for. Where is this aid being spent? Who's actually delivering the aid? Is it British or is it local producers? And the third issue is around aid and foreign policy. And I think there's probably going to be more of a shift to use aid to try and advance some of the British foreign policy objectives, particularly in a kind of post-Brexit world.
So we're on Facebook Live and we're talking about the importance of the international aid pledge, 0.7% in British politics. We've been talking here with Romilly Greenhill. We've talked a little bit about the history and we're talking now about what we should be looking out for in the upcoming manifestos. You talked a little bit about some things that we should be looking out for, Romilly, in terms of, you know, the aid in the national interest. What's the difference between that and tide aid? Is that one of the concerns around this area?
Absolutely. So tide aid means basically using, tying money to be spent on the goods and services from the donor country. So for example, donors might provide food aid and say, but it has to be exports from our country that are used for that food. So it's a sort of win-win. It's the donor country gets business for their producers and also the country gets some benefit. Now, actually, historically, tide aid has been really problematic because it tends to inflate the costs and it undermines local markets in the countries. Now, there is an international commitment to try and reducing tide aid, but you can still count as ODA. Under the ODA rules, you're allowed to have some tide aid. So I think that's very much the direction that we'll see British aid going.
And one of the other big changes that we've seen is it's not just the Department for International Development that's spending international aid now, is it? It's other departments as well. What do you think we're likely to see in those terms?
Absolutely. So the UK has an independent aid agency. It's actually quite unusual now in having that independent aid agency. But what we are seeing, and we have been seeing, is very much a trend towards money being spent by some kind of cross-government pooled funds, also by Foreign Office, Ministry of Defence, potentially trade, and also on environment, some climate funds and so on. So that's something I think we will definitely see accelerating. I think it's very important that we maintain a separate department in the UK. We actually did some research in ODI some years ago which looked at aid volume and effectiveness when there is a separate development ministry versus when there isn't. And we actually showed really clear trends that countries that have their own minister, that have their own department, actually tend to provide both more aid and also better quality aid. So I think the evidence really backs up of maintaining DFID as a separate department.
So we're on Facebook Live. If you're watching, share this video with your networks, but also ask us some questions. And I have a question from Laura in London. If every rich nation paid 0.7%, how much more development assistance would that actually mean for the developing world?
Well, the average at the moment is 0.3. So we're not doing terribly well. So I think it's safe to assume that actually if everybody met 0.7%, we would have more than twice as much aid as we have at the moment. We've done some calculations on the costs of meeting a very basic package of health, education and income security requirements for lower middle income country and low income countries. And actually if everybody met the 0.7% target, we would be able to offer that to countries. So it has a real impact actually, this money. And if more countries in other, particularly other donor nations committed to 0.7, it would make a substantial difference to the developing world.
And there was quite a lot of talk about the international aid pledge being really defining Britain's status in the world and being part of this sort of global leadership piece. Is that true? Do other countries look to us for international leadership on this?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the UK has a really strong position on international development, and 0.7 is a key part of that. I've observed a lot of UN negotiations where everybody gets together to talk about development, and actually the 0.7 is seen as very, very important, including for some middle-income countries that don't get a lot of aid. They nevertheless see it as sort of totemic of the commitment of rich countries, whether they're prepared to keep their promises in the international arena. So I think Britain, when we're thinking about this global Britain, we're leaving the EU, but we want to retain this global Britain role, it's actually extremely important that extremely welcome that commitment is made, because I think it does really sort of set the tone of some of our engagement in the rest of the world, and sort of the fact that we're seen as a sort of honest broker.
So we're on Facebook Live. We're discussing the International Aid Pledge and its importance in British politics with Romilly Greenhill. Please do ask us questions. Romilly, one thing that I wanted to ask you as well, you mentioned how the pledge had become totemic to political parties. Is it one of those ones that now people find very hard to step back from, do you think?
I think so. I hope so. I mean, I think the degree of cross-party support for the bill, the 2015 bill, which after all was only 2 years ago, was quite striking. The fact that you only had a very small number of MPs actually oppose that bill. It had support from the then Prime Minister and from the Liberal Democrats and Labour as well. So I think it is something that, you know, it does feel a bit like it sort of defines us. It's this sort of moral compass. It's sort of, who are we as the British people? What's our place in the world? And I think people do see the 0.7% as a sort of, as a bit of a bellwether or as a totem for kind of how we are as the British people. So I think and I hope that it's something that would be quite hard to move back from.
So one more question. Hannah would like to know, is 0.7% really necessary? It's an old target set, as you said, many years ago. With the growth of BRICS and the developing nations, wouldn't it be more appropriate to have a different kind of target?
Well, I think there's two things to say here. One is, you know, there are challenges with the 0.7% target in the sense that it is a target that focuses on inputs rather than outputs or outcomes, and it is quite outdated, as you mentioned. However, it's there and it's agreed and it is taken quite seriously, and I think there's a bit of a risk of sort of making the best the enemy of the good here. I think in the current context it would actually be extremely difficult to agree something different. So I think we've got a target, we've got agreed rules of what can go into that target, so I think we should absolutely stick with it. In terms of some of the BRICS, there are substantial contributions that many of these countries are making. In some developing countries like Kenya, for example, you know, China is on a par with the World Bank in some of the infrastructure sectors. So there, you know, quite serious volumes of flows coming from developing nations. But actually, these countries also look to 0.7. They want rich countries to continue to commit to 0.7. They're saying that, you know, they're offering their own funding, but that it should be additional to what rich countries are doing. So I think, again, thinking about the sort of the international dynamics and how we're seen globally, I think it's both 0.7 and commitments from developing countries, not one or the other.
So Romilly, we're on Facebook Live, and you can ask your questions directly to Romilly. And please do share this video with your networks as well. I guess one of the other questions around the international aid pledge is if other governments are seeing us as a kind of global leader in this, are there ways in which other governments are looking to us to kind of change the way we spend aid, or are they very much wanting us to kind of hold fast on it?
I think it depends on the governments. I mean, I think, you know, unfortunately there is this broader trend towards sort of aid in the national interest. That's happening everywhere. There's also a broader trend towards spending aid more on the private sector. Some of the recent changes to the aid rules actually have facilitated more aid money going towards private sector spending. So there is a sort of broader move both to using aid towards foreign policy concerns, aid to the private sector, and so on. But I think it depends who you talk to. I think a lot of the NGOs, also a lot of the developing countries actually, are looking to Britain to sort of maintain that leadership role. Some of the other donor countries might well be happy if the UK slightly moves in their direction around aid to the national interest, because I think it would sort of offer support to their position.
And I guess one of the final questions would be lots of rumours, of course, as we run up to the parties actually publishing their manifestos. But one of the rumours is that there may be a threat to the independence of the Department of International Development, perhaps it being folded into the Foreign Office or so. Not unfamiliar rumours come around almost every election. What would your sense of that be, and what does the evidence say about that?
Well, it's true that, you know, these rumours do circulate, and actually thinking internationally, again, other countries have done this. Australia fairly recently, for example, wrapped their aid agency into their foreign affairs ministry. So yes, it's something that other countries have done. I mean, we would be quite concerned about that because I think DFID does actually have a fantastic reputation as a donor. It does provide really good quality aid. It's scored very well on lots of the sort of internationally agreed rankings on transparency, on aid effectiveness, and so on. And I think some of the evidence suggests that where you lose that separate department, you actually do have an impact on both aid quality and quantity. So I think maintaining DFID as an independent and highly respected department is an important thing to do.
So we have a question from Miriam Boss, who says, very topical question, in your opinion, what is the impact of Brexit on the UK's role in international development?
Well, I think there's different dimensions to that. I mean, there's obviously going to be a kind of trade impact of Brexit. So through the UK, we have these, through the EU, at the moment we have regional economic partnership agreements, so sort of free trade agreements with various African and Caribbean countries through the EU. So it's going to be a very kind of clear impact of some of those trade relationships when we leave the EU, and we need to make sure that countries are still able to export into the UK on the same ground. So that's sort of trade picture rather than aid. I think there is this sort of global image issue of sort of how are we seen, how do people feel about the UK, and that's where I think this sort of global leadership role is particularly important. Then I think that there's also going to be quite a practical issue around UK contributions to the European Development Fund, for example. At the moment, the UK puts quite a lot of money into the EU, channels it via the EU, which actually makes quite a lot of sense to sort of pool funding with other donors. Now, the UK could conceivably continue to do that post-Brexit in the same way that it puts money into the World Bank or the UN or other agencies. But whether it would want to do that politically, I think, is a bit of another question. So I think there's some real sort of practical questions there around what happens to UK aid.
Okay, so Romilly, thank you very much. We're out of time on our discussion on aid and its place in the UK general election. If you want some more information, analysis, please do follow us. We're on odi.org. Romilly's also on Twitter. Romilly Greenhill, I think.
Romilly ODI.
Yes.
Romilly.
So, and thank you very much for your questions.